It was supposed to be a routine drive for Captain Eric Holden, a retired sailor, who had spent most of his life navigating treacherous seas. Now, the only adventures he embarked on were road trips across the country, enjoying the freedom of the open road. He had no idea that this particular stop, at a remote rest area, would change everything. The sun was beginning to set as Eric pulled into the rest stop off a quiet highway in rural Georgia. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few scattered cars. As he parked and stepped out to stretch his legs, his eyes caught sight of something unusual: a young black girl sitting alone on a bench near the edge of the lot. She couldn't have been older than 9 or 10, her small frame hunched over as she fiddled with her hands. Nearby, a white man stood by an old pickup truck, his posture stiff and his gaze darting around the lot. Eric's instincts, honed over decades of navigating dangerous waters and tricky human behavior, immediately told him something was off. The girl didn't seem relaxed or at ease. In fact, she looked downright scared. Eric decided to keep an eye on the situation as he walked toward the restroom. When he emerged a few minutes later, the girl was still sitting on the bench, but this time her hands were moving in a strange rhythm. Eric squinted, trying to make sense of it. That's when it hit him: she wasn't just fidgeting, she was signaling. It was Morse code. Eric's heart raced as he mentally translated the pattern. 3 short taps, 3 long taps, 3 short taps again. It was unmistakable: SOS. For a moment, he froze. Could he be imagining things? Maybe the girl was just tapping out of nervousness. But as he watched, the white man approached her, speaking in low tones. The girl flinched, her hands quickly dropping to her lap. It was enough to push Eric into action. He pulled out his phone and pretended to make a call, using it as an excuse to linger nearby. As he got closer, he heard snippets of their conversation. The man's tone was sharp, his words low and menacing. The girl said nothing, her eyes darting toward Eric as if silently pleading for help. Eric had seen enough. He wasn't about to walk away from a potential danger. Steeling himself, he approached the pair with a friendly smile. "Evening, folks," he said casually. "Everything all right here?" The man stiffened, his eyes narrowing as he turned to face Eric. "We're fine," he said gruffly. "Just waiting for her mom to come back." Eric's gaze shifted to the girl, who didn't say a word. Her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Something about the man's demeanor didn't sit right, but Eric knew better than to escalate the situation too quickly. He decided to press further. "Funny," Eric said, his tone light but probing. "I didn't see anyone else around when I pulled in. You sure her mom's here?" The man's jaw tightened. "Look, buddy, this is none of your business." Eric's instincts screamed at him to tread carefully. This wasn't just an ordinary encounter. Something was deeply wrong, and he needed to act fast. As the man started to usher the girl toward the truck, Eric took a calculated risk. "You know," he said loudly, pulling out his phone again, "I think I'll just call the local sheriff's office. Always good to make sure everything's above board." The man froze, his grip on the girl's arm tightening. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out, but then he forced a strained smile. "No need for that," he said. "We were just leaving." As the man opened the truck door, the girl turned to Eric, her eyes wide with fear. In that brief moment, Eric knew he couldn't let her go without knowing the truth. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Eric watched as the man attempted to hurry the girl into the truck. His heart pounded, every fiber of his being screaming that something was deeply wrong. Without thinking, he stepped closer. "Hold on a second," Eric said, his voice firm. "Before you go, maybe the girl should tell me if she's okay." The man turned, his face darkening. "I told you, this isn't your business. The girl hesitated, her lips trembling as her eyes darted between Eric and the man. Then, in a small, shaky voice, she said, I'm fine. Eric didn't buy it for a second. The fear in her eyes betrayed her words. If you're fine, Eric said gently, then maybe you can tell me your mom's name. I'd like to make sure she knows you're all right. The man's grip on her shoulder tightened. That's enough, he barked. We're leaving. Eric's hand hovered over his phone, ready to call the police. But just as the man opened the truck door, the girl dropped something, a crumpled napkin. Eric caught a glimpse of scribbled words before the man yanked her inside and slammed the door. As the truck sped off, Eric quickly picked up the napkin. Written in shaky handwriting were 4 words, help me. Not Dad. Eric's pulse quickened. The girl had confirmed his worst fears. Whoever that man was, he wasn't her father, and she was in danger. Without wasting another second, Eric got into his car and started following the truck, determined to do whatever it took to save her. Eric tailed the truck, keeping a safe distance to avoid suspicion. His mind raced as he clutched the napkin in his hand, the girl's plea for help etched into his thoughts. The road stretched out before him, the truck weaving through the lanes as if the man behind the wheel was trying to lose anyone who might follow. He dialed 911, his voice steady but urgent. I'm following a truck with a young girl inside. She signaled for help, said the man with her isn't her father. I think she's in danger. The dispatcher's voice was calm but efficient. Can you give us the vehicle description and your location? Eric quickly relayed the details, keeping one eye on the road. White pickup, older model. License plate starts with G5-4. We're on Highway 82, heading east. Officers are being dispatched to intercept, the dispatcher assured him. Stay at a safe distance and keep us updated. The truck suddenly veered onto a side road, kicking up dust as it sped down the gravel path. Eric hesitated for a split second before following. The road was narrow and surrounded by dense woods, the isolation amplifying the stakes. He couldn't afford to lose them now. As he closed the gap, Eric noticed the truck pull into a clearing. The man stepped out, scanning the area before opening the passenger door and pulling the girl out. She stumbled, her small frame dwarfed by his imposing presence. Eric parked a short distance away, his heart pounding as he watched the scene unfold. The man barked something at the girl, his tone sharp and angry. She looked terrified, glancing around as if searching for an escape. Eric knew he had to act, but he needed to be smart. This wasn't the kind of situation he could resolve alone. Keeping low, he crept closer, his phone still connected to the dispatcher. They've stopped in a clearing off a side road, he whispered. The man pulled her out of the truck. I don't think she's safe. Officers are closing in, the dispatcher said. Stay hidden and keep eyes on them. Eric's grip tightened on his phone as he watched the man grab the girl's arm, dragging her toward the edge of the clearing. Whatever his intentions were, they couldn't be good. Eric knew he couldn't wait much longer. Eric crouched behind a cluster of trees, his pulse hammering in his ears as he watched the man drag the girl toward the woods. Her small frame stumbled over the uneven ground, and her muffled cries for help were like daggers to Eric's resolve. He had to act, and fast. I'm moving closer, Eric whispered into the phone, keeping his voice low. I don't think I can wait for the cops. Sir, we strongly advise you to stay hidden until officers arrive, the dispatcher warned. Help is on the way. But Eric wasn't willing to gamble with the girl's safety. He pocketed his phone and moved silently toward the edge of the clearing, his years of experience in high-pressure situations keeping him calm. He picked up a thick branch from the ground, gripping it tightly as he approached. The man had stopped near a large tree, his back to Eric as he barked something unintelligible at the girl. She was crying now, her hands shielding her face as she tried to shrink away from him. It was all Eric needed to see. "Hey!" Eric shouted, stepping into the clearing with the branch raised. "Let her go, right now." The man spun around, startled but quickly recovering. His eyes narrowed as he sized Eric up. "Who the hell are you?" he snarled, stepping forward. "Someone who's not going to let you hurt her," Eric replied, his voice steady. "You've got two choices, walk away now, or deal with the cops when they get here." The man sneered, his fists clenching. "You don't know what you're getting into." "I know enough," Eric said, taking a step closer. "Let her go." The man hesitated, glancing around as if weighing his options. Then, with a growl of frustration, he shoved the girl aside and bolted into the woods. Eric wanted to chase after him, but his priority was the girl. He rushed to her side, kneeling down to check if she was hurt. "It's okay," he said gently. "You're safe now." Tears streamed down her face as she clung to him, her small body shaking. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Eric's phone buzzed in his pocket. The dispatcher's voice came through as he answered. "Officers are minutes away. Are you and the girl safe?" "We're safe," Eric replied, his relief palpable. But he ran into the woods. "Make sure they bring backup." As the sound of sirens grew closer, Eric held the girl tightly, promising her she was finally out of danger. But deep down, he knew the man wasn't finished, and this was far from over. The flashing red and blue lights of approaching patrol cars illuminated the clearing as officers arrived on the scene. Eric stood protectively by the girl's side, his adrenaline still coursing as he quickly recounted the events to the lead officer. The girl clung to his arm, too shaken to speak, but her tear-streaked face told them everything they needed to know. "Did you see where he went?" the officer asked. "He ran into the woods," Eric replied, pointing toward the dense tree line. "But he's dangerous. Be careful." The officers wasted no time organizing a search party, splitting into groups to comb the area. Meanwhile, a female officer crouched beside the girl, her tone soft and soothing. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked. "Layla," the girl whispered, her voice trembling. "Layla," the officer said gently, "do you know the man who was with you?" Layla shook her head. "He told me to call him Uncle Jack," she said, her words halting. "But he's not my uncle. He said my mom told him to take me." Eric's chest tightened as he listened. Layla's story was even worse than he'd feared. Whoever this man was, he'd used deceit to isolate her, and his intentions were clearly sinister. As the officers continued their search, one of them approached Eric and the female officer. "We've found tire tracks leading deeper into the woods," he said. "Looks like he might have stashed another vehicle there." Eric's stomach sank. If the man had a backup plan, he could already be miles away by now. "What happens next?" Eric asked, glancing at Layla. "We'll issue an Amber Alert immediately," the lead officer said. "And we'll need to take her statement once she's calmed down." Layla's small hand clutched Eric's sleeve. "Don't leave me," she pleaded. Eric knelt beside her, his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised. The officers escorted Eric and Layla back to a patrol car, where they waited while the search continued. Eric's mind raced, replaying every detail of the encounter, wondering if he'd missed something that could have stopped the man from getting away. But his focus remained on Layla. Whatever happened next, he was determined to make sure she stayed safe. As the night deepened, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The man who'd taken Layla wasn't just a random predator, he had a plan. And Eric suspected they'd only seen the beginning of it. Eric sat in the back of the patrol car with Layla, her small frame trembling as she rested against him. The officers worked tirelessly, scouring the woods and following the trail of tire tracks deeper into the unknown. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity, the weight of what had happened pressing heavily on Eric's shoulders. Layla clung to him, as if he were the only solid ground in a chaotic storm. "What if he comes back?" she whispered. "He won't," Eric assured her, his voice firm. "The police are going to find him, and he won't hurt you again." Meanwhile, one of the officers approached the car, her expression grim but determined. "We've got an update," she said, addressing Eric and Layla. "The vehicle he left behind was abandoned about 2 miles from here. We found a duffel bag with fake IDs, cash, and other concerning items. This guy's done this before." Eric's stomach churned. "Other concerning items?" The officer hesitated before continuing. "Maps marked with locations, and what looks like a journal with details about different children. It's disturbing." Layla's grip on Eric's arm tightened, her breathing quickening. Eric pulled her closer, his heart breaking for the fear she'd already endured. "What about her family?" he asked. "Have they been contacted?" "We're working on that," the officer replied. "She said her mom's name is Celia, but she doesn't know her last name. We're cross-referencing missing persons reports, but so far, nothing matches." Eric frowned. How does a child this young not know her mother's last name? "It's possible she's been moved around a lot," the officer said. "We'll get to the bottom of it, but right now, our focus is finding this guy before he hurts anyone else." As the officer walked away, Eric couldn't help but feel the pieces of this puzzle weren't adding up. Layla's fear, the man's meticulous planning, the cryptic journal, it all pointed to something much larger than a single abduction attempt. He looked down at Layla, her wide eyes filled with a mix of trust and terror. "Layla," he said softly, "do you remember where you were before he brought you here?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "It was a big house," she said quietly. "But there were other kids, too. He said we had to leave, because I was special." Eric's heart sank. This wasn't just an isolated incident. Layla was part of something far more sinister, a larger operation that needed to be stopped. And somehow, he knew he wouldn't rest until it was. Eric sat quietly as Layla's words echoed in his mind. There were other kids. The revelation chilled him to the core. This wasn't just about her abduction, it was a part of something far more sinister, and the man who had taken her wasn't acting alone. The lead officer returned, his expression grim. "We've just confirmed something," he said. "The fake IDs and maps in the vehicle are linked to a suspected trafficking ring we've been tracking for months. This guy wasn't just a predator, he's part of an organized operation." Eric felt his fists clench. "And what about Layla's family? Any leads?" The officer nodded. "We found a missing persons report filed by a woman named Celia James about 3 months ago. Her daughter, Layla, was reported missing after she disappeared from a foster care facility. It matches her description." "Foster care?" Eric repeated, his voice heavy. "She wasn't even with her mom." "No," the officer said. "It looks like her mother was trying to get her back, but ran into red tape. That's likely when this group got to her." Eric glanced at Layla, who was curled up on the back seat, exhausted but finally calm. His resolve hardened. "What do you need me to do?" he asked the officer. "I'll help however I can." The officer hesitated. "We need to handle this carefully. If we move too fast, we risk tipping off the rest of the group. But Layla might know something, locations, details, anything that could help us figure out where they're keeping the other kids." Eric looked down at her, her small face peaceful in sleep. He hated the idea of putting her through more questions, but if it meant saving others, he knew it had to be done. A short while later, As Layla stirred awake, Eric gently coaxed her to share more. "Layla," he said softly, "do you remember where the big house was? Anything about the area?" Her brow furrowed as she thought. "There were lots of trees," she said slowly. "And a train. I could hear it sometimes at night." Eric turned to the officer. "Does that help narrow things down?" The officer nodded. "It's a start. We'll cross-reference the maps with rail lines and forested areas." As they worked to piece together the clues, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that the man who had taken Layla was still out there, watching, waiting. The clock was ticking, and if they didn't act fast, more lives would be at risk. The clues Layla provided sent the investigation into overdrive. The combination of the train sounds, wooded area, and the maps found in the truck pointed to a remote property, just outside a small town 2 counties over. The officers mobilized quickly, organizing a raid to ensure no children would be moved before they could intervene. Eric wasn't supposed to go, but he refused to stay behind. "I've been with her through all of this," he argued. "I'm not leaving her now." The officers reluctantly agreed, letting Eric stay in a nearby command vehicle as the raid unfolded. Layla sat beside him, her small hand clutching his as the tension in the air grew thicker. "You're so brave," he told her. "We're going to make sure no one ever hurts you again." When the raid began, Eric's heart pounded with every passing second. The radio crackled with updates as officers stormed the property. They found a rundown house surrounded by overgrown trees, its windows boarded up. Inside, they discovered 3 more children, all frightened but unharmed. The man who had taken Layla wasn't there, but evidence linked him to the property, photos, documents, and another set of maps indicating other potential locations. The children were rushed to safety, and Layla's face lit up when she saw them. "That's them," she whispered. "We all stayed together before he took me." Eric felt a surge of relief, but his focus remained on Layla. The operation wasn't over yet, and the man who had orchestrated this nightmare was still out there. Later that night, as the officers debriefed, they received news that the suspect's vehicle had been spotted near the state line. Roadblocks were set up, and within hours, the man was in custody. The relief was palpable, but for Eric, the real victory was seeing Layla smile again, knowing she and the other children were finally safe. In the days that followed, Layla was reunited with her mother. Their tearful embrace was a moment Eric would never forget. As Celia thanked him over and over, Eric could only smile and shake his head. "She's the brave one," he said. "She's the one who sent the SOS." Months later, Eric would reflect on the events of that day with a mix of pride and disbelief. His routine road trip had turned into a life-changing rescue, proving that even the smallest signals can lead to extraordinary acts of courage. The suspect's capture was a relief, but Eric knew the work wasn't over. The raid had uncovered critical evidence, photos, fake documents, and more maps, but there were still unanswered questions. How many children had this man and his network taken? And were there more properties like the one they'd raided? As Eric sat with Layla at the station, the lead investigator approached. "We found something in the suspect's car," he said, lowering his voice. "A notebook with detailed notes. It confirms Layla was targeted, but it also lists more locations. We're dealing with a larger network than we realized." Eric's heart sank. He looked at Layla, who was now coloring quietly at a desk, blissfully unaware of the danger that had nearly consumed her life. "What's the next step?" Eric asked. "We're coordinating with federal agencies," the investigator replied. "The notebook gives us a lot to go on, but we need to move carefully. If we tip them off, we could lose our chance to shut this down for good." Meanwhile, Layla's mother, Celia, arrived at the station. Eric watched as she dropped to her knees, hugging Layla tightly, tears streaming down her face. I thought I'd lost you forever, she whispered. Eric felt a surge of emotion, but the moment was bittersweet. Layla was safe, but the shadow of the network still loomed large. Eric knew that while this chapter of the nightmare was ending, the fight against those responsible was far from over. As he prepared to leave the station, the lead investigator stopped him. "You made all the difference, Eric," he said. "If you hadn't noticed that signal, we might never have found her, or the others." Eric nodded, but he couldn't shake the weight of the situation. "What about the man who took her?" he asked. "Did he say why he did it?" The investigator's expression hardened. "He hasn't said much yet, but what we've pieced together so far points to a larger operation. He was just one cog in a very dark machine." As Eric drove home that night, his thoughts were heavy. He had done everything he could to protect Layla, but he couldn't help but wonder how many other children were still out there, waiting for someone to notice their SOS. The days following Layla's rescue were a whirlwind of media coverage, investigations, and emotional reunions. The evidence uncovered in the raid had led authorities to a series of coordinated operations across state lines. Dozens of children were rescued, and several members of the trafficking network were arrested. But for Eric, the true victory was seeing Layla safe and beginning to heal with her mother. Celia, Layla's mother, invited Eric to their small apartment for dinner a week after the ordeal. The warmth and gratitude in their home contrasted sharply with the chaos and fear they had endured. Layla ran to greet him, clutching a small drawing she'd made. "This is for you," she said shyly. Eric unfolded the paper to see a crayon drawing of him standing tall like a superhero, with Layla holding his hand. "Thank you for saving me," the caption read. "I didn't save you, Layla," Eric said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved yourself. You were brave enough to ask for help." As they sat down to eat, Celia shared more about the struggles she had faced trying to regain custody of Layla. Bureaucracy, financial hardship, and a lack of resources had left her vulnerable and allowed the traffickers to take advantage. "I thought I'd failed her," Celia said, tears in her eyes. "But you gave me my daughter back. I'll never be able to thank you enough." Eric shook his head. "I just did what anyone should do. You're the one who's going to give her the life she deserves." In the weeks that followed, Eric kept in touch with Celia and Layla, visiting often and helping where he could. Meanwhile, the investigation continued to unravel the full extent of the trafficking ring. Authorities praised Eric's quick thinking and willingness to act, crediting him as a key part of the operation's success. Months later, as Eric reflected on the experience, he felt a profound sense of purpose. His instinct to help, his years of training as a sailor, and his willingness to step into danger had all come together in a way he never expected. And while he knew the world wasn't perfect, the bond he had formed with Layla and her mother reminded him that even small actions could create ripples of hope. Eric never saw himself as a hero, but to Layla, he was just that, and knowing she was safe, thriving, and free was the greatest reward of all.